Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 77. Mississippi Born. War Baby here with another episode of Murderous Minors. Adopting a child is one of the most noble and courageous acts a parent can carry out, putting themselves second to helping a child have a better life. When Joe and Sue Carley of Ellisville, Mississippi adopted their son George when he was just 3, they only wanted to help him escape the abused and troubled life he was born into. The youngest of 3 boys, George's brothers were adopted by different families, with the middle son ultimately moving with his family from the area. His oldest brother Jason and he remained in contact throughout the years, even spending Christmases together sometimes. Their biological father had physically and sexually abused them, and the Carleys eagerly welcomed George into their family, which included a son and a daughter. They'd been actively involved in the congregation at First Baptist Church of Ellisville since they moved to the area in 1991 when George was 11. On this episode of Murderous Minors, we visit a mid-90s cluster of church boys gone killer and the havoc they wreaked on a small area of Mississippi. Joe and Sue Carley had moved their family outside of Ellisville to become Jones County Junior College employees, with Joe receiving a promotion. They threw themselves into church activities as well, spending almost every moment the church was open inside of it. The youngest of the brood, George Carley, was a respectful church-going kid who had learning disabilities in the areas of reading and comprehension, which led to his being held back 2 grades. In 1994, George's once mild behavioral issues increased, and he began seeing nearby psychiatrist Dr. Little in February. She diagnosed him with PTSD at that time. According to Dr. Little, George's condition caused him to suffer from psychosis, delusions, and hallucinations. While under her care, George was hospitalized twice in 1994, the first time for psychosis and extreme depression, severe enough to require antipsychotic medication. His condition failed to stabilize following his release, and it deteriorated quickly. After Joe and Sue reported that George had become verbally aggressive, he was hospitalized for the second time on July 22, 1994. After spending several months of 1994 hospitalized, George appeared to be getting better, though few even knew of his problems to begin with. The Carleys had had his oldest brother spend Christmas with them outside Ellisville and had vacationed in New Mexico over spring break, all the while attending church multiple times a week and sometimes several times in one day. No one in the congregation knew that George had gotten in trouble for driving his father's truck without a license or permission, or that he had recently gotten grounded for driving his 4-wheeler in the street. From the outside, most saw a regular teenage boy. There were those who felt otherwise, including George's younger friend Eric's mother, who said she simply didn't like the way he acted and she didn't really want him rubbing off on her son. Though both were in the 7th grade, Eric was a much more impressionable 12 years old, while George was 14. He lived next door to Eric's grandparents, in addition to seeing her son every day. When Eric asked his grandfather why he spent so much time with George Carley, he explained that it was because he was a troubled boy, so he went out of his way to give him rides home from school and take him fishing. The adults close to George Carley's home life could sense and see that this child had issues and needed to be handled as such. and given his horrific early years, they were all more than willing to do so. By all accounts, Sunday, March 27, 1995, played out like a normal day, beginning with Joe Carley cooking at the men's fellowship breakfast at the church at 8 a.m. Just after, neighbors recalled seeing George riding his four-wheeler around the Carley yard around 8:30. The family then attended their respective Sunday school classes before Sunday service, where their daughter sang a solo. After eating lunch there, the family arrived home at 12:30 before Joe and Sue returned from 2:30 to 5:30 for a ceremony dedicating the church library. They left again and returned with George for the evening service at 7 p.m., during which he attended his youth group. While there, he told two other teens that he had plans to kill his parents. Joe Carley stayed at church to attend a deacon's meeting, while George headed home, stopping first at his friend Eric's house. He wanted to invite him along on a church trip to Atlanta, Georgia coming up in June, but Eric had been away all weekend. He had already fallen asleep, and his mother did not want to wake him up just to speak to George. So the boy promised to come back the following day to invite his friend on the trip they'd never get to go to because less than 2 hours later, George's parents would be dead. After he returned home and his folks had gone to bed, George took the key to the gun safe from his mother's purse and retrieved a .22 caliber handgun from inside the locked cabinet. He entered the bedroom of the people who had lovingly plucked him from a terrible situation and shot them both in the head. George then went into his room, closed the door, got in bed, and pulled the covers over his head. It was 10:20 p.m. The 14-year-old stayed that way until he was taken into custody by police the following morning after his grandmother had found her son and daughter-in-law's lifeless bodies. Grandma Isabel had an apartment attached to the main house's carport and had entered to check on the family when she saw that they hadn't gone to work by 8:30 a.m. Monday morning. Entering the home, she saw Joe and Sue in bed before peeking into her grandson's room. But when she saw the covers up over his body, she assumed she had walked into a massacre. Police soon pulled him from the bed and questioned him on scene, the first in several interrogations leading to confessions that the defense would later question. As far as motive, George eventually told them that he did it because he was angry that he wasn't allowed to drive the truck or ride his four-wheeler in the road. Investigators ended up with an audio-taped confession made at the scene, a written statement signed by George, and a videotaped confession that police initially lost and recovered later. At his first appearance in front of a judge, George Carley answered affirmatively that he had in fact been diagnosed with a mental illness and that he was on a slew of medications that he didn't even know the names of. He was held on $200,000 bond on suicide watch in the Jones County Jail. Attorney Tony Buckley was appointed to represent George, and he began a 2-year journey to trial as they tried to establish things like his competency. The defense was looking for him to be sent somewhere like the Mississippi State Hospital in Whitfield instead of the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, where death row was located and which was the only option in the wake of a guilty verdict for murder, no matter your age. George's attorney said, quote, "We're going to see if the district attorney will do the right thing in this case. He will get paroled eventually if he goes to Parchman. One will turn out a monster. The other has a chance of helping the kid." Leading up to the trial, multiple suppression hearings were held over the numerous confessions that the defense felt were coerced. They took the issue before the judge several times, with George's psychiatrist, Dr. Little, testifying in the first hearing that his lower reading and comprehension skills made it highly unlikely that he understood much of what he was told or signed. The final suppression hearing was highlighted by the police department locating George's videotaped confession, which they hadn't remembered existed. But ultimately, the confessions were allowed and 16-year-old George Ogden Carley was found guilty on March 20th, 1997. His attorney had mounted an insanity defense, citing prior trauma resulting in George's inability to distinguish right from wrong, an allegation the state considered, quote, the abuse excuse. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences with no possibility of freedom until the age of 56. His appeal was denied in 1999. Just 4 days later, the trial of another local church-going teen would shock his small community of Sumrall, Mississippi, with local psychiatrist Dr. Little once again participating as a witness. 40 minutes from First Baptist Church of Ellisville, you find First Baptist Church of Olo, Mississippi, just outside the larger town of Sumrall, where the Greenlee family were members of the congregation. As George Carley's case crawled its way slowly toward its unsettling conclusion, 15-year-old Aaron Greenlee was living his life just a few towns away. A 9th grader at Sumrall Attendance Center, which housed grades 6 through 12, he was a well-liked, if not average, student. He was a popular lineman on the football team with an older sister named Wendy who was preparing to graduate from the high school. Their mother, 36-year-old Sheila Greenlee, was a well-liked cafeteria worker at her children's school and had a close relationship with both of her kids. On Friday, May 17, 1996, mother and son left school together, stopping for snow cones on the way home around 3 p.m. Friends would recall later that he was fine that day, completely normal as the freshman class celebrated winning a school contest with a pizza party reward. According to Aaron, Sheila had found out that he'd been in a small altercation with a younger boy earlier in the day and grounded him. But what he says she didn't know was that he'd gotten 3 hits of LSD from a different kid that day and that he planned to try it out that night. A carnival was in town, but Aaron getting grounded meant that he could not use his mother's van to attend with his friends. When they got home, they assumed their regular after-school positions with Aaron on the floor in front of the TV with a pillow and Sheila on the couch. She eventually got tired of him asking if he could go to the carnival that night and sent him to his room, where he paced angrily for a few minutes before dropping a hit of acid. He soon followed up with the final 2 hits and later explained that at this point, furniture started talking to him and the walls began to close in. This is when he grabbed his .30-30 hunting rifle, went into the living room and killed his mother with a blast to the top of her head as she napped. His sister Wendy came home around 5:45 p.m. and found her mother dead and her brother gone, just days before her high school graduation. Aaron escaped in his mother's van, stopping at 2 friends' houses before hitting the road for South Florida. Roughly 9 hours later, Aaron fell asleep while driving past the Windrift condominiums in Orange Beach, Alabama, and ran over a flower bed out front. The van came to a stop about 250 feet away, and while Aaron crawled into the back and went back to sleep, the security agency at the condos called police around 1:40 a.m. on Saturday morning. The first officer on the scene gave dispatch the plates to run while he asked Aaron, who had exited the van, a few questions, and they quickly advised that this was a suspect in vehicle in a homicide. A second officer arrived before Aaron was officially taken into custody, and the pair asked routine questions of a juvenile, like, "Where are your parents?" in accordance with procedure, to which he replied, quote, "My mama pissed me off, so I shot her." They advised him not to say anything further and transported the team to the Orange Beach Police Department, where they questioned him and took his bloody clothing into evidence. Since the small town had no juvenile detention facilities, Aaron was handcuffed to a chair in the annex where he promptly fell asleep. Between 2:25 and 2:54 a.m., the 15-year-old provided a taped confession as well as a written signed confession. When Lamar County, Mississippi investigators